Welcome to Negotiation Made Simple, where we help you master the art of negotiation and win the next deal. I am excited about this conversation with Richard Gabriel, one of the preeminent trial consultants in the country. Now, you may be thinking, John, what is it about a trial consultant that's interesting? Well, Richard has spent the last 40 years in over 2,500 trials helping lawyers think about how to influence the decision-making of jurors. And this skill set is critical for us as negotiators to understand how the human mind makes decisions, the psychological factors that are at play. How is it that we work with the bias that is present in all of us? Richard has been doing this for some of the most high-profile cases over the last 20 years or so. Casey Anthony, O.J. Simpson, Phil Spector, Kwame Kilpatrick. Some of these very high-profile civil and criminal trials, Richard has been the one helping lawyers think about the psychology behind how the jurors will decide these very, very important decisions. In addition to that, Richard has been recognized as one of the leading thinkers in this space. And as a result, he's appeared on CNN, CBS, ABC, NBC, Fox, MSNBC, and NPR as a commentator on high-profile trials. This is going to be an exciting and informative conversation. Let's go ahead and jump into our chat with Richard Gabriel. Well, Richard, I'm really excited that you're joining us for the Negotiation Made Simple podcast. You've been a jury consultant for decades. You have worked on some of the most high-profile trials in our nation's history. You spend a lot of time working with trial teams, thinking about how to influence jurors and how to impact decision-making. And I'm really excited about having this conversation today about how that applies to negotiation and what people do at the negotiation table as well. So welcome to the Negotiation Made Simple podcast.
Thanks, John. I appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to our conversation as well.
Well, the first thing we need to do is I want to give people a sense of your background. And I know just a tiny bit of it, but share a little bit about all that you've done over the course of your career with respect to trial consulting, and then tell people, for those who don't know, what a trial consultant actually does.
Yes. Well, a lot of people actually don't really know what trial consultants do. I've been doing this 40 years now. I've done about 2,500 trials across this country in most of the states. And we've worked on cases for a long time. A lot of the high-profile cases that you may have heard of are O.J. Simpson and Casey Anthony and Phil Spector and Whitewater and Enron cases. As well as Kwame Kilpatrick, the Detroit mayor. And recently I did a case involving A$AP Rocky here in Los Angeles. What we do in trial consulting is essentially we are the bridge between how the lawyers understand their cases and how they communicate them with the jury. A lot of times the attorneys spend most of their time on the legal principles and the evidentiary issues that are involved in the case, but sometimes aren't as familiar with how a jury, a lay jury, actually is going to understand that case. So we do focus groups and mock trials to help them understand how an actual jury might understand their cases. What are the potential life experiences, beliefs, and biases that might affect their interpretation of the case? And then to help their witnesses prepare to communicate more effectively to the jury, how to be strategic in the jury selection process, and then fundamentally, how the attorneys can tell the best story. Because as we all know, that's the way people process complex information. Over the years, written a couple books, one called Acquittal, which talks about some of the high-profile trials, jury selection, strategy, and science. And when the pandemic hit, I found that I saw everything come to a grinding halt. And I wanted to make sure, since we have the Sixth and Seventh Amendment, which entitles the public's right to a jury trial, that we continue this. So we help the courts better understand how they might be able to facilitate or continue to have jury trials online. And then recently, because there's been so much public distrust in a lot of institutions As a matter of fact, Ora Carrington just published a survey, talked about this really precipitous drop in public confidence in institutions, including our justice system. I've been involved in this project called the Trust in Justice Project, which measures and tries to better understand what is causing that distrust, and then what do we do about it so that we can restore some fundamental faith in our justice system, which I believe is one of the cornerstones of our democracy.
You bet. Well, I've been privileged to work with you now in a couple of different arenas and look forward to doing more of that as we kind of pursue our separate careers in the litigation arena. But there's a lot of people listening to this podcast that are like, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a litigator. I don't want to spend any time in a courtroom. I want to stay away and stay out of a courtroom as best I can. But I still negotiate every day. I still have to put deals together. I still have to influence people. I still have to resolve problems. And so what I want to do is just have you share a little bit. This is something that we've talked about in moments where we've been together about really what is done in a courtroom, how it mirrors what needs to be done at a negotiation table, and the skills and the ideas and the psychology around trying to influence a jury are very similar to that which a negotiator might use in terms of influencing a counterpart. And so talk a little bit about, where do you see the mirroring? Where do you see the integration between what's happening in a courtroom and what's happening at the negotiation table?
Well, I think one of the things that I spend my time do is how to understand how people actually make decisions in the case.
Sure.
And that's the fundamental, my company's called decision analysis, because all we do is understand the complex and individual and idiosyncratic way that individuals make their own decision-making process. And a lot of times when we come to a trial, but also in the negotiation as well, everything becomes positional. You've got these two sides, so you have this sort of binary situation where can appear on a surface like it's an adversarial situation. You have wants and needs, I have wants and needs, somehow they conflict, and we have to work it out here. And so the problem that I see sometimes in the courtroom is that we become so positional that we stop listening. And so fundamentally, one of the things that we spend our time doing with our attorneys, because they work up cases and they, here's what our case really is. And I tell them, I said, we don't know what your case is until you actually listen to the jury, until you actually have them tell you what your case is, because your case is only as good as what they're going to listen to.
Sure.
And so one of the things I spend most of my time is telling them to stop and start with what they call beginner's mind on a case, despite all the work that they've done, and to start listening to what's going on there. Because until you understand better how your audience, whether it be in the courtroom with a jury or whether across the negotiation table, the more you listen and better understand what is motivating them, then you have better information as to how to approach it.
That's really powerful stuff. And the application is significant. I mean, the idea of a negotiator, one of the things that we ask people to do from a negotiation standpoint is, you got to prepare. And we talk a lot about preparation. But the reality is that just like in a courtroom, the process is dynamic. And the reality is you can prepare all day long, but it's not going to follow your script perfectly. And so the presentation that you make to kind of kick things off, that may go as planned, but everything after that may go a totally different direction based upon what you hear and how the other side reacts. And so it's really, really important for negotiators to be dynamic, and the preparation doesn't come with perfectly executing the script. The preparation comes from being skillful enough to be able to react strategically to what they hear and what they experience from the other side in terms of trying to work towards a deal. So I love that notion of what you just said right there in terms of it really starts with listening, and it really starts with understanding how they're seeing things and then thinking strategically how it is that you connect into those in order to bring about influence. So go ahead.
No, I just wanted to add, for me, it's even listening that happens before you're putting together your presentation there. Because
Sure.
what you described is absolutely accurate. Once you get in there, you make a presentation, then you have to be open to whatever is going to happen in terms of the reaction from the other side. But sometimes the listening, I find, starts with, as we're developing our presentation, and then the analysis becomes, what are they likely to do?
Mm-hmm.
What are their moves? What are their needs? What are their wants? What is the motivation that is driving them? Because that can inform then how you actually put together the presentation.
Yeah, I want to talk more about reading the room in just a second. But before we get there, talk a little bit about some of the influential things that happen before you as the negotiator ever start talking. So things like credibility, things like the first impression. I know that that's a big deal. I remember when I was trying cases, I'll never forget the night before my first day in court in a trial environment. I had the partner that was trying the case. I was like the fourth chair, sitting way in the back kind of thing. But I remember he came up to me and he said, what are you wearing tomorrow? And I was like, I don't know. I got a nice suit. And he's like, well, don't wear that one. And I was like, what do you mean? And he was like, I want you to wear your oldest, simplest suit. And he says, this briefcase that you have, you cannot bring this into court. He says, you got to find something else. He's like, this is way, way too nice. And the thinking there was, he says, we represent a Fortune 100 company.
Yeah.
And he was like, we cannot walk in there with a jury looking at us saying, these guys got really nice suits, really nice briefcases. They must have plenty of money. And so it was a really powerful lesson for me in the importance of a first impression.
Well, you're dead on right here. And it's, as you said earlier, it's reading the room. It's understanding who your audience is before you move in there. And that's, I find so, so important. Credibility is built on a few things. And a lot of times I think mistakenly, we think credibility is like with experts, with resume credibility. Here's everything I've done, and here's the schools that I've been to, and here's all the articles I've written and stuff like that. That's not how people judge credibility. Credibility is based on trust, and credibility is based on how you affect. So, and it also, I feel, really has to do with intentionality, because if you come in there, I think this is an important point these days. A lot of times in persuasion these days, the model is very old that we are working from typically, which is that I have to persuade you, John. I'm going to be forceful. I'm going to be powerful. I'm going to make great arguments to persuade you that I am right here. And then the other side's going to do it. But these days, audiences don't want that. They don't expect that, and they're innately suspicious of being sold and being told what to believe here.
Wow. So
I really do believe that credibility comes with the ability of someone to really engage with who they're talking to listen to them, to make sure, because if I'm listening to you, then there's more likelihood that you're going to listen to me. So if I come with it with the intentionality, number one, firm in my position.
Sure.
Very having great conviction in what my position is,
okay.
But also the openness and the willingness to listen to you and to engage with you in this process here. It's hard. It's much easier for somebody to sit there, if I'm coming in hard charging and scorched earth type of mentality here, for you to go, okay, the walls go up immediately and you get more entrenched in your position. What I'm trying to do, and I'm trying to do this in the courtroom too, is the fundamental question of how do I open up the listening of the jury and even the other side, even my opposing counsel, to make them go, wait a minute, I now have to rethink this stuff. And so I'm avoiding behaviors that I think cause lack of credibility, which causes that resistance. There's actually some jury research, not just jury research, but psychological research called resistance persuasion, which talks about how people become resistant to persuasion as opposed to this sort of fundamental model of, oh, I'm going to craft my message and I'm going to send this message and somebody's going to listen to it and then they're going to either adopt it or not. There's all these walls that are sort of instantaneously very easy to come up these days to even filter what people are listening. And as we all know these days, people live in their bubble. They live in their social media bubbles where they have created their own little realities. And that confirmation bias really creates a filter upon which they're going to listen to the evidence. And so if I can somehow break that bubble and get them to listen more clearly, that's, to me, is the heart of credibility.
Wow, I've got a bunch of questions about bias, so we're going to get there in just a second. But before we leave this topic, if I'm hearing you, there's kind of a new formula of credibility that involves authenticity and connection and empathy and things like that, as opposed to just, your prestige or your experience or your background and things like that. And it's really powerful for kind of people to know. And it really points us to a new way of engaging people, to where if we want to do business with someone, this notion of we don't have enough time, the notion of we can just sit down and talk business, really it kind of brings us back to this idea of saying, it's what I jokingly call, being from the South here, it's the value of a glass of tea, to where, having a glass of tea with someone, while that may not seem very productive, it's actually extremely productive in terms of building credibility. And there are some other cultures that do this much better than the American culture. But I think it's really important for people to understand that they're creating time, creating space, and being intentional about that personal connection that oftentimes can set the foundation that you need in terms of being influential.
Let me give you a quick story on that, if you don't mind.
Please.
Because this just happened this week where I was reading the news and I saw this concept. For 10 years, Taylor Swift, who we all know,
sure,
was trying to get a hold of her original master recordings of the 6 original albums that she had produced under Shamrock Recordings there, and was unable to get the rights back for 10 years. And literally she got close in negotiating the rights back a number of times and stuff like that, and it all fell through. The last time she went to negotiate, instead of sending a team of lawyers to negotiate, she sent her mom and her brother.
Interesting.
And her mom and her brother sat down with Shamrock and did all this stuff and sat down with them. And lo and behold, a couple months later, she was able to purchase the rights back. So when you talk about that personal connection, that thing there, it really underlines for me how important that really can be.
So one of the things that I like to do on this podcast, Richard, is I like to make it really, really practical. And so what I want to do is ask you a very, very practical question about how you read a room. Like what are the micro reactions? What are the hidden objections? What are the different behaviors, as subtle as they might be, that you're looking for that gives you the signals that you need to understand kind of where you are and what is the psychological dynamics that are present in the room?
Yeah. Well, of course, I like to do as much research as I can before even getting in the room. So I like to see whatever the backgrounds are of whoever I'm dealing with. I look at their web pages. I try to read even their articles that they've written. If they've written anything, we'll visit their social media sites if they've got availability and stuff, just to get as much understanding as possible there. Then when I'm in the room, I like to understand the power dynamic. Who's the one who's going to be the decision maker? How are they discussing? How are they talking? Who's the one who's actually doing the discussions? This is the one thing that we always look for when we're doing jury selection, because in a jury of 12, there's really only 1 to 2 people who are going to be the opinion leaders in the jury. So the people who, and it's not necessarily, yes, there's, the people who have, inherent institutional credibility, like they're managers or CEOs or they're professors at universities, that carries with it. But sometimes it's just the person who's talking the most in the room. So I'm observing that. I'm looking at the body language a little bit to see if there's any micro cues that I can pick up on to see whether people are, and then I'm trying to analyze, what does that mean? Who here is nervous? What is the factor that's driving this? And then aside from just the nonverbals of this, nonverbals, research has shown we're all pretty bad at actually interpreting nonverbal behavior. I know we like to think we're clever and we can tell everything by somehow people's body language. We're terrible at it for the most part.
Okay.
So that's why I just like to start talking to people.
Uh-huh.
And so as much as possible, I like to try to engage even opposing counsel and anybody is there to try to just get a sense of who they are as people. And I start with something very innocuous, just talking about whatever is the weather, the traffic, something like that, just to get them going. Personal self-disclosure is also very important because once you are disclosing something, it's very hard for somebody to stay pretty closed off at that point. So I will talk about my kids, something to do with my kids or something like that, or a recent vacation that I did, or something that's a current event in the venue that I'm working at. One of the things you said is, Fortune 500, you're in a different culture when you're in the South versus when you're in New York, when you're in a rural community versus when you're in a metropolitan city. So understanding the dynamics, in LA, we just had the wildfires. And if I'm doing an insurance case, it's on everybody's mind. So understanding local events and things like that and being able to touch on those things of common interest helps to build bridges and helps me to understand who I'm dealing with on the other side.
All right. So you mentioned earlier, and I'm excited about going to this part of the conversation where we start thinking about bias. And bias is not something that often comes into the negotiation conversation, but I have become fascinated by the notion of bias and how bias really does play into how we put deals together, how we resolve problems, the thinking around how bias gets formed. And then I also want to spend some time with you thinking about what are the strategies to overcome bias, because all of us, depending upon the environments we're in, there will be moments where bias is working for us. And there will be then moments where bias is working against us. And that bias could be as simple as a customer preference in terms of we like this vendor and we don't want to change, where you are a salesperson for another vendor trying to get them to change. Or it could be something that's much, much deeper in terms of how they see the world based upon their experience and how that then colors all the decisions that they make. And so talk to us a little bit about, as you think about people and their decision-making, what are the biases that are most significant and what do those biases do in terms of someone's mind as far as how they make a decision?
So I love this conversation because we often think of biases in the negative. Mm-hmm. It has this real negative connotation. Bias is built into all of us. It is how we operate. It is how we survive. It is virtually the filter and the screen by which we view the world. So it's not negative. It's just literally we have life experiences and that we're raised in a certain way in order to survive in this world and in order to operate. And we have all kinds of biases and stuff. And I like to think of this in a particular way because obviously we spend time dealing with this in jury selection, trying to understand what are those things. And it's not negative. It's just bias is a spectrum that goes from just a impression, of something to a preference to all the way over to an actual prejudice about certain things. And so understanding, instead of thinking of it as a bias, I like to think of it as just what is the life experience that has informed a person's worldview? What is the values that they were raised with that does that? And how do I better understand that? And so that's why engaging with somebody and finding out how they process information is really important. And I don't think of it oftentimes how we overcome bias. I think of how do we use the bias? How do we better understand their life experiences? Because I'll give you a quick example. We have let's say we have a medical negligence case where a number of jurors in a particular venue has a bad experience with a particular hospital or has a negative outcome that happened from there too. You're not going to eliminate that.
Yeah.
You're going to have to address it and get them to talk about it, because the problem is the hidden bias is the bias that's most dangerous. If you don't address it and have people understand, hey, it's not a bias, it's just you've got a life experience that affects the way you see things. Once they can articulate it, then you can deal with it. And then you can understand, what do I need to do to educate people to understand that their life experience or their belief system does not necessarily apply to this particular situation. It's funny, bias is based on sort of the psychological principles. And in the legal system, we're actually pretty bad at addressing the psychology of human decision-making. Mm-hmm. Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky spent their decades doing cognitive research on biases, on all these hidden implicit biases that we all operate in. And it informed the work of Richard Thaler, who won a Nobel Prize for behavioral economics. And it's applied everywhere. But we get into a negotiation situation, we get into a courtroom, and sometimes we kind of ignore the psychology of how people make decisions. And we think, well, it's all just got to be factual. So I always think that's going to the confirmation bias is the key one. Understanding because people are always going to gravitate toward filtering information about what they already believe. So understanding the confirmation bias, the belief perseverance bias is also important, which is kind of an adjunct to confirmation bias, which means despite new information, people still want to believe what they want to believe.
Sure.
And stuff. And there's norm theory, there's biases about just personality, which I think is very important too. The motivation, the why, who people are, is very important bias. It's we call it fundamental attribution error, which is the fact that we tend to attribute behavioral and characteristics or personality characteristics to people. So understanding how people see you, how they trust you, how they have confidence in what you're saying there is very, very important. These are all sort of the different biases that we take, in the courtroom. Hindsight bias is very, very important to look at as well. Because again, when something happens, you have all the knowledge and you can say, well, of course, everybody knew that was going to happen and stuff too. So those are the kinds of biases that I tend to track, but there's a ton of biases that's very important to better understand how people are processing information and where they're coming from.
Yeah, so let's just jump in and talk about one of those. So we don't have time to talk about all of the different biases that are at play. But the one that I do want to jump in, because I think it is very prevalent, is this idea of confirmation bias. And I think it's very real in terms of from a negotiation standpoint. And confirmation bias neuroscience is beginning to teach us. It's not just psychological. It's actually, it has to do with the physiology of our brain, just
Right.
not being able to make 35,000 decisions a day using a full comprehensive analytical process around each one of those decisions. And so the brain has to shortcut, and the bias is how the brain shortcuts. And so confirmation bias is, this idea where, the brain already has a predisposed belief. And so it shortcuts to try to affirm that belief. And in doing so, what it does, and this is what's so important for people that I'd love for you to speak to, is it tries to eliminate the information that challenges the belief. And then it looks really hard to affirm the information that supports the belief. Right. And so, where I see the miss, and you probably see it as well at trial, is, you have at one level a case that's being tried at an emotional level, and people form biases out of their first impressions, out of their emotional reactions. And then there's another level to the trial where there's a lot of data, there's a lot of facts, there's a lot of experts that are providing technical testimony. And the reality is that there are a lot of jurors, and you tell me if I'm wrong, because I shouldn't be talking about jurors with America's leading jury consultant, but there's a lot of jurors that just psychologically can't get there in terms of going to that comprehensive technical analysis, because their bias, whatever it is just, it's spitting out that information and it's not letting that information sink in. Same exact thing at the negotiation table, and especially in the business context, to where people have their biases. They have their impressions in terms of, what organizations are high quality, what organizations are dependable, what organizations will feed my ego or won't feed my ego. All of those different biases, those already exist out there. And so if you're trying to just put a deal together as a small business owner or as a salesperson that's out there just hustling to make it happen, it's really important to kind of understand that this is going on inside of the minds of the people that you're trying to work with. But then importantly, trying to figure out, okay, well, what do I do about it? Like, thanks, John and Richard, for telling me about the dynamic, but what do I do about it? And so I'd love to have you share just a little bit in terms of, what do folks do about this? How do they deal with it? How do they work through it? How do they influence it?
So, I always use the phrase, data is not information, is not knowledge. And oftentimes we get into a negotiation situation or something like that. And the truth is, we spend a lot of time in the information thing. And what we're trying to do is bypass those barriers that are automatically put up, that gravitate toward things. When people get cognitive overload, when they get, we call it cognitive load here, where they just get too much complex information or conflicting information, they will always go to the confirmation bias. So I always try to figure out, okay, how do I bypass that? And the simplest way to bypass that is to tell a great story.
Sure.
It's the only way I find to do it. So despite whatever you're going to be presenting, and how do we convert all of my data, all of my information, whether it's in a sales situation or negotiation over a contract, into the story, into something that people go, because that's harder to ignore on the other side. It's harder for the other side to put up the barrier when you're talking about people, personality, and the story. I mean, I don't know exactly what happened in the negotiation room with Taylor Swift's mom and brother, but when they come in there and they're not dressed like lawyers and they talk about, when Taylor was a little girl, and tell them a story about Taylor, it's so disarming. What do you do with that? So it's harder for them to just kind of go contractually back to those steel points that they were going with and stuff. So it's, how do you convert whatever you're trying to negotiate into a really good story that includes a few things: the character, the motivation of the people there, the vulnerabilities even. So a lot of times in these negotiations, we kind of have to oppose all the strengths and stuff that we have, our leading points there. But exposing some vulnerabilities strategically also allows the other side to to develop a little bit of an openness to what we're doing there, as well as, the components of a good story are character, environment, and action.
Yeah.
So understanding how do you tell a story which starts at a particular place and then moves to another place, and that escalates the action so that people get caught up in it. We just, I always like to use the analogy with the attorneys. I said, when you are talking about a trial story, you have to think of it you have to think of yourself as both Ken Burns, Doris Kearns Goodwin, and Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Wow.
So because you're kind of behaving as a documentarian, you're not just telling a story, you're telling Ken Burns is a masterful storyteller, but he's using actual facts, actual history to do it. And Doris Kearns Goodwin, again, fabulous historian, tells great stories in her book. And Neil deGrasse Tyson has the innate ability to take really complicated physics and make it completely understandable and compelling and fun for people. So I look for models of people, of how do you tell a great story, and because that by itself really, I think, does bypass a lot of the confirmation bias.
So a quick example I'll share real quick with folks that I think reflects what you just said really powerfully. This is something I use in negotiation training across the country when I'm working with companies, and it's an iPad Air commercial. And I don't know if you remember, Richard, when the iPad Air came out, but it was about a year or two after the iPad came out. And here you had Apple that released this new device. People paid $500, $600, $700 for a new iPad. And now all of a sudden, Apple follows that about 18 months later with a new version of it, the iPad Air. And so Steve Jobs has to figure out, how am I going to convince all these people to spend another $700 for a new unit to replace the one that's only 18 months old that they just bought? And so the bias that he realized he had to overcome was this bias of, I already have an iPad. Why do I need this iPad? I've already got one. And so what he did, his first attempt at doing that was he took out an ad, and it was the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, one of the big national newspapers. And he did a 2-page, full-page ad. And on one page, he laid out all of the specs of the iPad. And then on the other page, he laid out all the specs of the iPad Air. And then he highlighted the differences in the specs and how the iPad Air is so substantially better than the iPad because it is 2.4 gigahertz versus 1.6, or whatever the case might be. And it didn't go anywhere. They launched the iPad Air, and it was an absolute train wreck. And so he was freaking out. The Apple was freaking out. They had this product that was not hitting the market well. And so Steve Jobs went to his friends at Pixar, which I think he had just acquired at some point through this process. And Pixar said, hey, let us take a crack at, trying to tell the story and why the iPad Air is so powerful. And so what Pixar did was they created a commercial. And this commercial is still available on YouTube. I would encourage people to go do it. Just do iPad Air commercial. And this commercial has Robin Williams that is just reading a Walt Whitman poem about life. And in the middle of this, it just is showing people that are playing sports, that are writing poetry, that are doing science, that are practicing medicine, that are doing agriculture. I mean, all these different things of life. And then in the commercial, there is the iPad Air that you see them using. And you get to the end of this poem where Walt Whitman gives these, these powerful words read by Robin Williams about what will your verse be? And then there's just a black screen and it just says iPad Air. And as soon as that commercial came out and started telling this story and putting the iPad Air as the facilitator of this story, sales took off and it did exceptionally well. But I think it's a business application of the reflection of your point that we've got to figure out how to tell stories and make the human connection, because just the data itself isn't influential enough, even if the data is really powerful in our favor.
Yeah. No, I think that's really true. I mean, I'm always searching. We oftentimes in business, whether or in litigation, we don't necessarily think of ourselves as creative people.
Mm.
And yet that's the important part of it is, he went to Pixar and Pixar went, okay, what is going to move people? And they went first, you get Robin Williams to do anything, you're going to improve sales.
Sure. Yeah.
Because he is, and then you have this beautiful poem that is bringing, and then you show people doing things in their lives with the overlay of that emotionality of what is it, as if this facilitates the poetry in your life. This is a device and it's just associating that with it. So, I'm always looking for what is the emotional touch point in a case? What is the emotional touch point in the other side? I'm always looking for what, is it ego that's driving them? Is it deep hurt? You and I work on cases where sometimes people have had a bad accident, there's been a bad outcome in the case, and we have to understand that. And so understanding how do I make that emotional connection with the other side? Because when we do negotiations, it's money becomes the vehicle, but it's not the passenger in it. So we deal with the money, but what's driving the demand? What are the needs of the person? What's that emotional touch point on the other side? And it is there in every negotiation. So having a better understanding is what is driving the other side, what do they need, and then if it's a negotiation over money, what else? That whole idea of how do you create creative alternatives to money, because money will always create the blockade.
Yeah.
Because you can always be too far apart to actually arrive at a solution there. So if you can have a better understanding of the psychological need of what's happening on the other side, then you can start thinking, what would fulfill that need, as opposed to just then, how do I become more entrenched? How do I be more forceful in doing this? How do I become more strategic or clever in my concessions and things like that?
Yeah. So a couple more questions. Our time is about up. I think everyone would be upset with me if I didn't ask this question. So talk to us about one of your landmark cases and one of the lessons that you learned about people or about psychology or about what we're talking about here today. Tell us a story about one of those cases and one of the lessons that you learned from those cases that has shaped you.
God, there's so many. I'll give you two very quick examples. So,
Great.
Obviously the most famous case is the O.J. Simpson case and stuff. And for me, that really made the point of understanding your audience, because we tried this case in 1994, started in 1994, which was 2 years after the Rodney King incident. A vast majority of our jury pool were Black. We had a lot of Black jurors in the jury pool who had themselves a tremendous amount of experience, negative experience with the police. They brought a perspective to that. So despite whatever evidence was going to be presented, our view was that there was obviously some collusion within the detectives to whatever the evidence they had to make sure that they really focused on O.J. Simpson there. So, and I think the prosecution failed to truly understand who their audience was. And so in that particular case, and this goes to this concept of framing, which we haven't really talked about, which is very important.
Yeah.
We didn't frame that as defending O.J. Simpson. We framed that as we are the prosecutors prosecuting the L.A. Detectives and the police department in how they handled this case. Yeah. And we had a very, very receptive audience on that. Second, so we understood what the bias was in that jury pool. We understood where they were coming from and what they were going to be receptive to. Second quick example had to do with the Casey Anthony case. And this is a case where a young mother accused of killing her own kid, tremendous bias. I mean, it is the worst possible scenario. People will forgive just about anything, but that kind of, years of negative publicity, overwhelming bias in the jury pool there. And yet when we tried the case, we did a focus group before then, we found, despite all the evidence that they had, one fundamental truth abide, which didn't make sense. Here's a woman who all the testimony was she loved her kid, and that there was something really dysfunctional in the family. And so the jury understood this may have been a tragic accident, but she didn't kill her kid. And for me, the learning point there was how powerful character is in understanding how people, the more they understand the why of why people do certain things, it's easier for them to understand what happened in terms of the actual evidence there. So those are two sort of big learning points that I had from the two cases that I worked on.
Yeah, the last example that you shared is interesting because I got an email from a lady just the other day that talked about just, she was in conflict in her workplace, and she had listened to an episode of the podcast that she found particularly helpful, and she sent me an email to thank me for it, which I was grateful for. But she talked a bit about how she just couldn't understand, how people could do this and how they could take this position, and it sounded like it was, a pretty tense kind of situation. And especially people that were supposedly on the same team, how they could treat each other so poorly when they're all on the same team. And I think there is a lot of that, which is why communication is so critical, because it does give you a sense for people to explain. And once you understand, the situation and the mindset that people were in when they made a particular decision, it does provide some more perspective that helps that decision make sense when you just look at it on its face and it makes no sense at all. And so she was working through that process and trying to uncover that, and she was becoming much more enlightened about her own conflict in terms of people kind of seeing that and understanding and appreciating that. And so it's an interesting lesson, that question of, really trying to understand why people do things. And many times when you get there, you're like, okay, that's probably not how my mind would have processed it, or not how my behavior would have played out, but I can understand how someone gets to a place to where they do that, or they make that decision that's not totally illogical like it looks like on its face. So really, really interesting stuff. So last question. Again, going back to wanting to be super practical, okay? Yeah. And so you're not advising a trial team at this point, but you're advising someone that is getting ready for a very high stakes, very important negotiation. It might be in a legal arena trying to settle a lawsuit. It might be in the business arena trying to put together a really big deal. What would you coach them? What would you say to them in terms of how they need to explore this kind of psychological world that is going to be at play in that deal or in that conversation?
I would say, from a fundamental level, the most practical thing to do is to spend as much time crafting questions as you do your presentation.
Great thought. Yeah, I love that.
Because if you don't understand, we spend so much time crafting our positions in a negotiation or in a legal situation that we don't take the time, because the questions serve two purposes. It gives you utility of information. And so spending real time going, what are the questions that I'm going to ask that really elicit a quality of information that then I can use? That's, to me, is the key, because questions give you quality information and they also tend to build rapport. with the other side. So that to me is one of the most fundamental elements that I would say that will then inform everything else.
Outstanding advice, Richard Gabriel. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks for this very insightful conversation. And I hope we can do it again sometimes. Thanks for being a part of the Negotiation Made Simple podcast.
My pleasure. Great talking to you, John. Enjoyed it very much.
Well, the valuable insights from this conversation are plentiful. I took so many notes in terms of some of the simple ideas that Richard Gabriel shared with us in terms of how we deal with cognitive bias. How is it that we use story to better communicate and be more persuasive at the negotiation table? And then I absolutely loved what he said at the end in terms of, in addition to thinking about making our case, or in addition to thinking about the presentation that we are going to make, to spend as much time and to be intentional and careful and strategic in crafting really good questions. And those questions can unlock people sharing from their perspective what it's all about. And in doing so, that will give us a path on how we can put deals together, how we can resolve problems. The power of a really good question and what that means in terms of connecting people so that we have credibility and influence. Richard Gabriel has given us a lot to think about. I encourage you to consider it and to jump in and start practicing some of what he shared. And if you do, I'm confident it will make you a more effective negotiator. Thank you for listening to Negotiation Made Simple. We look forward to seeing you on the next episode.